Good morning and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion with Jump. And this week we're doing a talk about, is your team fit to perform next year, or are you training them or draining them? I'm often sort of said, and I've been saying this for quite some time, I'm sure Dave will know this, and I'm sure Martin will get to know this, that I'm often being said that Ali quoted that he trained hard to fight easy. Where I think most recruitment businesses that I come across are completely opposite. They train easy and recruit hard. And what that leads is to a lot of issues within the recruitment process. So we're going to look at how we can develop, business. We're going to look at how we can follow the stats that will give us some indication on why training is so critical, especially when it comes to launching your business out of a downturn. So sales performance. Sales training increases sales performance on average by 20%. Continuous training can result in a 50% or higher net sales profit per head. 84% of sales training content is forgotten within 3 months. Sales coaching, i.e., coaching people, can increase the annual revenue by 8%, the win rate by 28%, and increase productivity by 88% compared to just training alone. And despite the clear benefits of training, only 17% of companies report having an effective training program. 85% of prospects and customers are dissatisfied with their on the phone experience, and only 2% of cold calls result in an appointment. 75% of business to business buyers and 84% of C-level or vice presidents, obviously an American report, executives use social media to make purchasing decisions. So what your team post and what you're training them to post actually counts. 8% of salespeople require 5 follow-up calls. So think, if it's not the same call, therefore you need to have 5 different calls. So have you got a sales call strategy, and are you training them that? And 52% of underperforming companies do not measure the effectiveness of their training. And surprisingly, 82% of leaders consider themselves as accidental managers, which means they've had no form of formal leadership training at all. And although some may be a natural fit, the situation we obviously see in recruitment quite often is they're not a natural fit. And a study found that 28% of employees had left a business because of the negative relationship with their management, and 33% said they were less motivated to do their work because of ineffective management and the training that they have received. So it says there's a lot to be done in training from a staff point of view and from a management point of view, whether you're a solo business or whether you're a growth business. And today we're going to discuss that. Today I've got Dave and Martin. Paul apparently is on a train talking to everybody on the train. So the train will be enjoying that on the way to Bristol. So I'm going to kick off because I think there's quite a lot to sort of talk about today. So should a recruitment business have a clear understanding of the skills and competencies that consultant managers need to thrive in today's market? And if so, how are you going to identify them? Because the market is always changing.
Right. Well, Martin and I are now waiting for the train guards to come in and answer the question thoroughly and formally, with Paul going, "No, it's not that." It's interesting, Ad. I think that's a really fascinating question. And I almost think there's a pre-question to the question as we run our businesses, and that is, let's define today's market. Not now, not on this webinar, but I think it's really important as leaders running businesses that we actually know what the market is that we're trading in. Because for me, this is very much an event driven economy. We can plan as much as we like, but then we have things like COVID comes along, things like the financial crash comes along, you get war in the Middle East and war in Ukraine, and all of these big events which we have absolutely no control over. So as leaders, how do we define a market which is ridden with events? And therefore our people have to be trained and have to be aware of it. So I think there's work to be done for everybody on, well, what is today's market? If we are a market that reacts to events, how do we train our people for that? Because most of our people are still relatively young, I guess, compared to us, he says, and they've not been through anything like this. So the last 5 years, 6 years has just been a fluctuating event-driven economy. And I think it's going to be like that again with the changes in America. So it doesn't really answer the question directly, how, but I'm sure I will as the webinar goes on. But I think we need to look at what is today's market. What is the market we want to train for?
Well, I think you're taking Paul's position there, where I ask a question and he answers something completely different. So I quite understand that.
I'm not on a train, I promise. I'm not on a train. He's not here. He's not next to me.
And here's Martin, the self-professed that I'm going to add intelligence to this conversation.
Well, I'm going to annoy you even more, Howard, because I'm going to challenge the question in that you talk about the skills and competencies changing in the current market. I actually think that the underlying competencies of a good recruitment consultant and a good manager are the same now as they were when I started 25 years ago. If I think about the best leaders I've worked with and seen in action, they have the same humility, curiosity, resilience. Those kind of capabilities are still there. I would agree that the environment we operate within is always changing, and I point to the fact that how we communicate with our teams and how we train is now driven by technology and through events like this, using Teams. It used to be sat next to the person listening to their phone call and saying, why did you ask that question? Why didn't you ask this question? That's increasingly difficult when people work from home. So I think the skills and competencies exist, but the medium we operate in has changed and we have to adapt to that quite effectively. But I'd also throw out a bit of credit to the people listening to this call. The billing manager's job, in my view, is the hardest job in recruitment, because you have to understand the skills and competencies, you have to consistently live and breathe by them, and you have to be able to articulate them to someone in a way that resonates with them, and you have to do it all at the same time. So I think that training and training doesn't switch on when you decide to train someone. If you're a leader in the business, they're observing you and they're watching you and they're being trained whether you like it or not. So that always on mindset, I think, is one of the toughest roles in recruitment.
And I think we'll cover that further down the line with a question about management training and things like that, because I think that is really important. And like you, I think that is the most influential job in the business, because they are the barometer that everyone underneath them take. And obviously, they're the ones that are helping drive the business going forward. And I think when I wrote the questions, I'd started to do the research before I started to write the questions. And I think the phrase that sort of jumped out to me was that continuous learning and performance needs to adapt, because I think we are changing. I think most recruitment agencies have technology that if they use correctly, would identify that continuous learning is essential to maintaining that competitive edge. And I think we don't sort of look at that, and therefore reviewing your data, implementing ongoing training ensures that recruiters are up to date with the latest trends, the techniques and the best practice. And I think understanding what they are is really important. And therefore, I think the stats said that continuous training led to a 50% increase in sales per head. Now, if you start to think if you could do that, that would be absolutely brilliant. But think about the stats that underscore the performance, and then how you foster that culture of continuous development to help grow your sales. And so I think constantly we identify the gaps in the issues, whether they're by training on sales, use of tech, understanding the market trends, look at new products that we're going on, and that list goes on. But we need to refine our skills, because like you, Martin, I don't think recruitment's changed that much. Yeah, how we do it has changed, but what we train and what we do hasn't changed that much. So that means that we've got to sort of adapt to the changing market and make sure that the constant of training happens, and that will help grow. So one of the critical reasons why people stay at businesses is because they feel they've been invested. So if we want to invest in people, let's invest in how we develop them to compete in markets that change constantly and quickly. And I think that's what we don't realize, that how quickly the market changes and how constantly it changes, from there. So the question that sort of then sprung into my head was, how do you equip consultants to have a consultative, value-driven conversation that differentiates a recruitment business from its competitors?
I just want to add to Martin's comment earlier on, because the value-driven bit is tied in with your sort of previous answer, Martin, about integrity, resilience. These are sort of skills that matter. I spent yesterday evening with the staff directors of a company that I'm working with, and they had put on a Christmas party to say thank you to all their clients. So they had about 60 clients there, and I was talking to their clients who I don't know, because I know the company, about what it is that makes this company a good company. And the answer was they're trustworthy. You know, when I speak to them, I know I'm going to get an intelligence response, and it was actually music to my ears to hear. And that's down to the way that the leaders, the billing managers, and the leaders respond to their staff, and they are training them all the time without realizing it. Exactly your point, Martin. When a bit like the Tom Peters comment about management by wandering around, that's what they're doing all the time. And your point, Howard, when you said that 20% of only 20% of people get trained, and that results in a boost. But after 3 months, it's forgotten. So therefore, it's got to be continuous. So that management by wandering around, that constant coaching, is really, really important. And the value bit is ask your customers what it is you value about our organisation. What is it that we do that brings value to you, and train on that. That's what I'd do.
I'd agree. I think the first way to ensure that your consultants are having value-driven conversations is to have a really clear value proposition as a business, and make sure your consultants understand it and live and breathe it. And that, to your point, comes back to hiring the right people in the first place. Hire people that resonate with your business values, and that are curious enough to want to understand it more, and to have those conversations with customers. And then your point about training, people forget it. It is that ongoing training. It doesn't necessarily have to be a top-down training. We used to have a scenario in an office I worked within, where we got our team at the start of a morning to have a huddle, get together. We had a physical ball, and we'd literally throw the ball to someone. And if you caught the ball, you had to say something you learned the previous day that would be of interest to your team. And you did that for a couple of minutes, and everyone learned something new. So when they were on calls with their customers, they'd say, "Oh, I heard this earlier on today." And it did two things. It kept people listening and engaging with customers, but also because there was an expectation that they would have to bring something to the table, they would naturally ask questions of their customers when they were speaking to them, to try and draw information to be able to have a good conversation. So just that kind of always on mindset of learning, I think, is really key as well.
So I think it's really interesting that you sort of talk about that. And I think we have this sort of one size fits all training approach, which is great for new recruits and great for refresher training. But how often do we do that? Where we should be thinking about, do we customize, and how effective is our training? That if we customize our training to be based around the values of the process that we're trying to deliver to our clients, then surely we'll do that. So we've got to mirror what the market needs, and therefore got to understand what our recruiters need to effectively drive performance in a value position. And I think it's interesting. I've been working with a number of agencies that have on what I'd class as more bespoke delivery, which recognizes the importance of tailoring their training to what they're actually trying to deliver to their clients. And that approach has allowed them to target and develop skills, but it's also allowed them to target and develop certain clients and what they can sell to those clients. So rather than trying to sell the same thing to every client, they're targeting every client slightly differently, and therefore they're having to train on slightly different sales all the time. And that's created a great value base, but it's mixed in new and traditional methods of social media training, traditional call training, meeting training and things like that. But it's allowed the company to increase its revenue from its existing client base. But more importantly, it's started to create consistency from new clients being brought into the fold. And therefore, it's equipping candidates and consultants to actually understand there's a difference between selling to buying clients that are already buying from you, to new clients, and to resurrect lapsed clients, and how to prevent that. And then there's obviously this change in the marketplace and what you're trying to sell to keep yourself ahead of your competitors. So I think you've got to customize your training. Just the off-the-shelf training no longer it works very well for new recruits and refreshers, but to make a difference, and I think that's to make a difference to beat your competitors, you have to innovate in your training.
Yep.
So the question then that leads to is, how do you ensure your managers then are coaching, motivating, and leading effectively to maximize team performance and retention?
I think that your point at the top, Howard, was really important, that one of the key reasons people join companies or stay with companies is because they're being developed and improved. So it's not optional. We have to do this in order to retain staff. I'd use the caveat that retention shouldn't be the goal. It should be a byproduct of good training, because anyone can keep a disengaged person in the business and it's not necessarily healthy. So we have to focus on the activities of training and development first and foremost. But I'd say as a business owner, you can ensure your managers are doing it by giving them the time and the tools to do it. So you have to have clearly mapped out career paths. You have to show on those career paths and training pathways the expectation from the individual that you're expecting them to dedicate time themselves to learn and to develop. So I think you have to give the management team the tools to do it. But one of the other things I'd say is also track it and tell the individuals what you are doing with them. The amount of times I've seen a business where I've spoken to the staff and they say, I don't get any development or training here. And then you talk to the manager and they say, what they're talking about. I sit with them every day for an hour and help to improve them and give them advice and give them guidance. But because it's not formal, the individual thinks they're not being developed. So actually, as part of the engagement and appraisal process, play back to the individual the time you've spent with them, the money, not always money, but if you've paid for them to go on courses or development exercises, show them what you've done. Show them the journey they've come on so they are proud of what they've done. They see the development and they see that motivation, and that will help with retention, I think.
It's interesting. I don't know how you two feel about this, but often I'm a great believer that people perform in the way that they're rewarded. This is particularly true of consultants. So if you pay them because you want urgent jobs filled and they're not being paid for developing long-term relationships, they're going to behave how they're rewarded. And I wonder how true that is as managers as well. So I know of one company that 50% of the manager's comp is based entirely on their own personal development. So they have to demonstrate to the board how they have developed themselves. So there's training offered for them as well, and coaching as we would expect, but it's also about what they learn. And they have to demonstrate every 3 months, they have to demonstrate what they've learned. And they have to demonstrate it to the whole company as well as to the board. And I think that's really a really important point, because often people see training as something that is done to them rather than something that they have to embrace, that they have to learn. There's a follow-up. Howard, you said it earlier, you get trained and then you kind of put it on the shelf, so to speak, or you leave it on a PDF on your home screen and you don't look at it again. So it's about getting that learning mentality, that learning culture, and don't wait for it to happen to you, just be involved in it. So for leaders, I think it's really important that they have that culture themselves of, I want to know more, I want to learn more, and this is how I want to pass it on.
Yeah, and in danger of actually answering the question this time, Howard, I think the bit about how to ensure your managers are coaching and mentoring, I think the first thing is, when you promote people into management roles, don't assume because they could do the job that they are good coaches and mentors. If you put someone in that role, you've got a responsibility to support them, develop them, give them the freedom to make some mistakes and take some risks, and have that vulnerability to come to you and say, I don't know what to do in this situation. So you've got to kind of create that environment, and don't just assume that good billers are good managers.
Yeah.
And I think that, that's why I love going last, because it takes all the issues that I was going to talk about off my plate and makes me think of a new issue. So thanks for that, Martin. But I think if you look at that, I always think that, solo businesses and small businesses don't think very much about their management training, when actually you're that person that needs training. So going back to your conversation there, Dave, about, you need to be training and developing yourself, you need to be accountable for your own action, then becomes really important. So I think improving your training or improving your management performance is critical, because that prevents that toxic environment, it prevents that attrition rate, it prevents below sales performance. And bad behavior, if it goes unchecked, that by management, that creates more bad behavior. And therefore, we've got to start to look at that as a huge issue. And that comment about 82% of managers are accidental managers who've never had any training, going back to your comment, Martin, I think therefore in the career ladder, we should be building training into the levels below that. So I've just done that with the company for the last 3 or 4 years, where every year I go do a management training course, but not for the managers, for the people below that manager. And what they said after the second time we did that, they said it was really interesting, is that you've got the managers developing the team, etc. But now you've got mini managers on the floor as well, understanding what the managers are doing, and therefore also implementing that, which makes the team stronger, makes the team more uniform, and makes the team going forward. So having that in your career ladder, I think, it becomes important because that creates that consistent growth. And what it did was a very interesting one about that 82% of accidental managers. It gave all those people that were looking to be promoted and thinking management was their next step. It gave quite a few of them a shock and saying, well, actually, I don't want to do that. So what else can we do? So we created a different career ladder for the solo biller, etc. And that's really created a really good dynamic within the business, because rather than being pushed into management, they have a separate channel to go down and doing that. So I think my last word on sort of that management training is that in a modern world, I think in a modern world, what you'd expect, if a kitchen fitter came to your house, you'd expect them to be able to fit your kitchen. If you went to the dentist, you'd expect them to be able to do that. But those people have continuous training. So I think it's the same for managers. We need to train them to be the most influential people in the business, because they are the people that actually influence everyone below them. And they're also the people then, when they step up to the next levels, can start to see what's going on. But as the further away they get from the coal face, the less influential they become. So I think we've got to train them when they start to leave the coal face to actually develop that further and work from there. So I think as solo businesses or small businesses, that's you, the owner of the business, and as bigger businesses, obviously your management structure from there. So how do you establish then if your team is energized and engaged, or how do you recognize the signs of burnout that could impact performance in the long term?
And that's that bit, isn't it, of walking around, being close to your people. You can see as a leader, as a manager, if you're a trained person, you've got a modicum of intelligence, you can work out with your people whether they're engaged or not. And I think energized is a big plus on engaged. Some people just want to come and do a job, and they're engaged, but that's all they want to do. And it's important in some ways to recognize that actually the people who are doing that are really important parts of our teams. They may not show any effervescent love for the business, but they do a good job. They're consistently hitting target, and that's it. It's a job to them, and that's okay. The ones that are energized are perhaps the future leaders, the ones that are going out and seeing more customers, or have got really good engagement with candidates. And you could see that. And of course, what that does, if you're a smaller team or smaller, it exposes those that are not like that. And I think as a manager, it's really important to get alongside them and ask them and talk to them about what it is. Now, that means that you've got to have a fairly open culture. Because if your culture isn't open, or your leadership style isn't open and supportive and engaging, then people aren't going to open up and talk to you, because they may be afraid if they really tell you how they're feeling, how you're going to react. So I think it's important as a leader of the business to know how your managers or your billing managers are going to deal with people who perhaps aren't engaged as they should be. But it's giving them an opportunity to say, this is why I'm perhaps not as engaged as I could be. This is why I don't feel energized about this company. But also to recognize that not everybody has to be completely buzzing all the time about the company. But having good people doing good work is okay.
Yeah, and I think naturally as leaders we would look to data to help us establish if our team members are energized and engaged. As in, if activities start to drop, our assumption is that people are less energized. And there is merit in using data to measure performance, but you also need to look at the conversion ratios as well. So any idiot can send out loads of CVs to the marketplace, but are they still working in a qualitative fashion, and are they still working positively? So I would advise looking at data, but I'd caveat it with looking at the quality. Because for me, when I think about in my career, when I was most engaged and least engaged, it all comes down to when I was connected to the why, when I understood the purpose of the business, I understood my role in it, I understood when I was getting rejections and when I was running into brick walls, the benefits of keeping going, not just for me personally, but for the organization. And it's tempting in a good market. We always talk to our staff about how well we're doing, and we're smashing budgets and hitting targets, and we publicize them. In a tough market, we tend to go into our shell a little bit and don't communicate with our staff how we're doing and the importance of activities. We kind of feel a bit nervous about sharing bad news with them, but actually making sure that connection between their personal why and your corporation's why is still really important for people to feel engaged and energized. If you go back into your shell, people drift and wonder why they're doing it, and that's when you see motivation levels drop.
Yeah.
So I think we've talked about sort of a lot of things there, but I think the first thing that I started to do when, and I'll use the word burnout, before that became a vogue sort of word, I'd look at things like the temperament, small changes in attitude, small changes in performance, small changes in things. And it was those behaviors that indicated to me that there was a potential issue that needed to be addressed. Now, obviously, yes, you could use stats, you could use data to help back that up. But to me, it was being close enough to my team. And I remember I'll use a business that I've been sort of doing lots of management training over the last 3 or 4 years ago with. And I was delivering some training. I think it was the 4th session out of 6. And I'd got to know that cohort really well. And after the session, I always had a catch up with the MD, still have a catch up with him of what was going on, what was working, what's not working, etc. And I told him, I said, I think one of your staff is approaching burnout or looking to there. And he asked me why. And I said, look, the last session, they were really interactive. They were really interested in the topic. They were really engaging. They were engaged with others. They did the same thing in this session, but without any passion. It was just as if they were just going through the motions. And the MD said, yeah, I've sort of noticed a couple of these things over the last couple of months. There's sort of some sort of things. They've had a little bit more sick. They've been a little bit more late. They haven't volunteered for projects that they were normally volunteering for, etc. And guess what? 3 weeks later, that person handed their notice in. But if we'd have noticed that that disengagement was happening earlier, could we have addressed it? And I think that's the bit that I always start to look for. I look at trends, I look at data, because that gives me an idea on performance and what's happening with performance. But I look at individuals and look at what temperament they're bringing and how they're behavioral reacting. Has there been small changes? Has there been minor changes? And if there is, that's the bit where I start to step in and start to have conversations rather than letting it get too far, because as soon as it's gone too far, they've already exited the building and started to leave from there. So to me, I think data is great, but I think it's having that understanding of the individual and of the small personal changes, what those changes look like. So talking about metrics then, so performance metrics, this is a really interesting question. I've thought long and hard before I sort of wrote this question, whether it's the right question to ask in this type of format. So performance metrics, should they be aligned with behaviors and outcome that drive sustainable growth, or are they inadvertible causing short-term thinking?
I don't mind
Well,
going first.
Yeah, go on.
So you're right. It is a really interesting question, Howard, and I think the answer is it's challenging to come up with a really concise answer here. I think in the short term, you have to have short-term performance metrics. I think any business that doesn't track input activities on a daily basis will struggle to get the discipline needed to have that growth momentum that we need. But I do agree that just focusing on short term can reduce kind of long-term growth plans, and it can impact your ability to win new business as well. So my advice would be to track short-term metrics, but make sure they're very input focused and just celebrate the success of activities. The output, so revenue generating outcomes, I would look at that on a broader, longer term perspective, no shorter than monthly probably. Because if you're looking at pure outcomes on a day-to-day basis, you will drive short-term thinking, and it will be to the detriment of the business in the long term. But you do have to have something that tracks activities and keeps focus and discipline on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis.
Yeah, I agree, Martin. I think it's very difficult to not use data. I think the data is so ubiquitous now, isn't it? There's so much available. I think the thing as leaders that we have to recognize is measure what matters. Decide what matters, measure that, and maybe use that in your board meetings. And to your point about the why, Martin, if the people are engaged with the purpose of the business, and this is the purpose, and this is how we're going to get you there, and this is the data we're going to use, and there may be, I don't know, 4 or 5 points that they measure them on, I don't think there's any excuse for them not being involved in the business and not being aligned to the purpose of the business, because you know what you've been measured on. Some companies kind of measure literally everything. I was speaking to somebody the other day about measuring, they're just not picking up the phone. And yet we started this webinar by you saying only 2% of cold calls lead to a meeting. And we know that unless you're very, very good, not every meeting leads to a piece of business. So, you're making 98, 99 calls that just don't get you anywhere. And we know that it's the seventh interaction where people make a buying decision. So and this is a rhetorical question, is measuring the number of calls you make in a day a relevant measurement for somebody? And I would suggest that perhaps it isn't, not in today's modern world of recruitment. So that's one piece of data that I wouldn't use. Yep. But clearly, some of the ratios on closing candidates to interview, that's a key one. If 10 people are going for interview and you're only making one sale, then there's something wrong there. So that becomes a measurable data, but only measure what matters. Don't measure everything.
As I said, I thought long and hard about this question because I thought, well, I've got to answer it at some point as well. So I've got to sort of think about
can't get away with it.
Yeah, can't get away with it. So I can't say, well, thank you, you two. That's great. Brilliant. Move on. And I thought, if you want to drive the right behaviors, you need to align those to the performances that you desire. And that's the bit, it's the performance that you desire. Therefore, it's not about analyzing performance, but it's about consistently training on the values that you want your clients, your candidates, and your consultants to feel from you as a manager and as an owner of the business. And so I remember pointedly at Computer People, so owned by Adecco, and Adecco had a training arm that trained everybody. There's 2,000 plus people in the business. We had 800 leavers every year, so obviously something wasn't going well. So many brands, not enough trainers. So what I did was I went to the brands and said, right, okay, what should we do? And I looked at then trading needs analysis for each individual office that I was running. I was running about 12 offices at the time. And I said, right, okay, if we create a manager's suitcase where there's 20 to 30 management training bites, half an hour long, we train the managers and then we implement that training into the business, and it's down to the managers then to do that training, then will we see an upturn? And what we saw was where the managers invested in that training and invested in their team and invested in the behaviors, they had a huge upturn in revenue and a massive decrease in turnover of staff. Where those offices that didn't implement that, we didn't make it a mandatory, where those offices didn't implement that, we saw average performance and an increase in people leaving the business. So it sort of said that if you want to help develop your people, aligning your behaviors with your training and with your outcomes, okay, starts to make a better performance. And so if we start to think about those things, we've got to drive performance based on the values that we are proclaiming that we have. Therefore, if we're not training our managers and our people to deliver those values, then value doesn't become a question. Value becomes not even a byproduct. It becomes something that's forgotten because people won't provide that value to what the level that you're expecting. And that's what I have seen, and that's what I will always sort of put my hand up for and say, to me, that consistency in training constantly helps develop. And what we did was we used what each individual office, because each individual office every week would be training something different based on what their office needed at the time. And if I was walking into those offices, I'd be asking what's going on, because I'd want to be doing some sort of training or coaching and mentoring with the staff based on what each individual office needs rather than just a generic. And therefore it became more value-based and individualized per office and per person than just ad hoc training based on what we think everybody needs from there. And that leads to the second to last question, was how important is team culture when it comes to encouraging innovation, collaboration, and ownership of the results? And do you think, in your experience, that training or lack of training then would hold back potential growth?
Yeah, I think, was it Peter Drucker, the famous management consultant, that came up with the phrase that culture eats strategy for breakfast? Yeah, we talk a lot about strategy, and absolutely we need to have a strategy, we need to have a plan, we need to know how we're going to get there. But wrapped around all of that is the culture of your organization, your leadership style. And in order to get strategy done, you need to have a culture where everybody understands their purpose, everybody understands their why, everybody understands what it is that they're doing, either for their clients, for their candidates, or for their colleagues. And I think the importance of culture cannot be underestimated. I've seen some great businesses with great culture that have had rocky times but have stayed together, and a low performance has dipped as the markets come back, as their individual market has come back. They've absolutely accelerated away and really performed. Whereas some business that would have, should we say, a less good culture have had great bits of performance, great months or years of performance, but then it suddenly all got away. And people leave and they're having to start again. And it depends on what you want to do with your business, what your long-term plan is for your business, but ideally retaining and keeping your good people and developing them and developing your leaders and offering training and management and learning. If you've got that in your culture, if that's in your DNA, then I'll suggest your business is going to perform better than the market.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Dave. I think I saw a presentation at an event recently, and the speaker gave a really simplistic statement, but actually it kind of resonated with me. He said, businesses fail because they meet a problem they are unable to solve. And that was his statement. And the point being, the more thinkers and the more creativity you have within your business, the more likely you are to find a solution to the problems you face. And as a business owner, the temptation is to think it's your responsibility alone to solve the problems of your business. But if you can create a culture where people come to you with solutions or suggestions, challenge each other to be innovative and creative, then you're much more likely to have the ability to overcome any obstacles that the market might throw at you in the changing environment that we talked about at the top of the meeting. So I think that's really key. And I know that there are businesses there who probably got a top performer generating lots of revenue, sat in a corner, not engaging in the culture. But you're thinking, I need to protect my cash cow, my revenue generator, and I'll deal with the culture elsewhere. And I don't think you have that luxury to leave that top performer isolated. You have to bring them in and try and encourage them to share their success, what works for them, and harvest that culture, just so that you can overcome problems that you haven't even seen coming yet.
So I think I'm going to revert slightly back to my last answer, and those that didn't see an increase in revenue because they weren't doing something consistently to help improve. And I'm going to jump onto I can't remember if it was Dave or yours answer, Martin, about managers training. It was Dave, was it, about managers training and growing themselves? And if they're not growing, I always thought myself as a manager, if I wasn't growing and developing my own skill set, then I was stagnating. And if I'm stagnating, I'm going backwards. And therefore, I had to look at that. So one of the sort of, if you think about the UK market, there's a key reason why 82% of the UK recruitment companies turn over less than £1 million, and that's turnover, not gross profit. Okay, and that's their management line. And I'll say their management, I will say they fear, and I'm not sure whether that's they recognise the fear, but they fear change. They fear of moving away from what they know because it's what they don't know that they fear. And sometimes it's what they don't know that actually starts to develop them. So I was with a client yesterday and I'd classed them as a continual learner. And over the past months, we've been working on changing their sales strategy to go from one market into a different market and to develop that market. And one of the things we were talking about is how do we create more time? Off her own back, she's gone back to the sales rep for their CRM, and she's got them to implement twice a month a half an hour session just talking about the new products and new processes that the CRM has brought out. And she said, oh my God, we have created so much time because we've got now using so much more of the CRM that creates time for us because we didn't realize it did that, including their CRM. They can put a job spec in, get candidates found for that, and the CRM will read the CV and say what percentage match it is to the job spec. He said, I'm now getting to candidates straight away rather than spending hours going through all the CVs. That's doing it for me. But they never knew that. So it's that continual growth. And I think, I'll go back to that stage, that comment that you said, Dave. If you're not learning as a leader, then no one else underneath you is learning. So it goes back to that thinking about your culture and what's going on. And we talk about strategy, execution, people, and people being you, clients, candidates, consultants, and your suppliers. Are they liking the strategy, and does that drive cash into your business? And I think if we start to look at how we've answered that question, It's all about that end product, which is driving cash into the business. So if you get the culture right, get the training right, get the development right, it will drive cash into the bottom of the business, which you can then spend to redevelop the business and move the business forward. So last question then. Shouldn't an agency, no matter the size, prioritize training and development as an investment for the business's future? And how often should an agency be updating their training methods and resources?
So the easy answer is yes, training has to be a priority. I think it's come through all of these questions that we talked about today. There's no way around it. I would also say that don't necessarily think that training needs to be an expensive external resource. It can be more organic than that. It can be continuous within your business, and it can come from different areas, and members of your team can run training courses on what they're good at. So there's different ways of looking at it. I'd say that the two main types of training that I would want to see in a business continually are learning new things. So when you bring a new technology into your business, there's obviously then training people to adopt new behaviors, new technology, new processes in a right way. So there's that kind of fresh learning, but don't underestimate the reminder training. So going back through processes that people may think they already understand, just to make sure everyone is using them in the right way, learning from each other, refreshing that memory. I coach my daughter's football team, and we, on a Monday, a big chunk of each session is spent doing stuff that they probably go, we know this already. But actually, it's about making it become automatic for them. It's about making it become part of their DNA. And that reminding training is as important as teaching someone something new. So it's just having that as a continuous learning in your business.
Yeah. And the continuous learning has been a thread through the whole of this this webinar, hasn't it? So I think all three of us would say how important that is. And you know, I like business as a person. I like learning about business. I don't know whether I'd have as a hobby business, or that would make me sound like a bit of a nerd. But if you like something, you want to tell somebody about it. So if you are, as a leader, learning, and you're reading a book, or you're listening to Audible, or you're doing a podcast or something like that, share it. Share it with your fellow partners. Share it with your billing managers, and get them to share it as well, because that creates that constant culture of learning. So yes is the answer, of course, that you should prioritize training. You should prioritize learning and development, because the better companies are the ones that have that as a priority. L&D in the old word, that's how we used to call it in the big companies, L&D. Now it's just on the job. It's just an expectation that you will bring new information and understand the way markets are going. You know, markets are changing all the time. So should you update your training to reflect the market? Well, of course you should, because the market's changing all the time. And I go back to my point. When you're in an event-driven economy, sometimes you don't have that control. So as Martin said at the beginning, your behaviors have got to be the same whether the market's good or bad. And if you have learning and development as part of the culture, then you're onto a winner.
I think before I put myself on a new training course to stop asking close questions, so mine can't say yes to an answer. I think the one word that came out of all of that was the desire to create the habit of training. And Martin's analogy there of training his daughter's football team to keep doing the same things, And if you sort of start expand that, this is our game plan, and so they'll train that game plan. But then they'll say, but if this happens, then this is what we're going to move to, and we'll train that next game plan. So they always have something viewed, and that's a view where when you get to sort of professional sport, they're watching their opponents and they're saying, this is what they're doing, this is how we can beat them. So they have a game plan that they think that their game plan can win, but if they don't think their game plan can win, they change that game plan. And I think that's what we've got to start to think about recruitment. We've got to keep training the core basics to do them really well, so they become habit and they become an automatic function. But then we need to look at the playing field that we're playing on and adapt accordingly to make sure that our strategy can be executed to make sure we win. And training has to be right in the middle of that, because we can't just change the strategy or ask people to execute more unless we tell them how to execute and train them to do that properly. And I think that's the sort of biggest crux of the sort of modern recruitment business is you walking through the door, you get 2 days, maybe 3, maybe 5 if you're lucky days training, and then you are a fully fledged recruitment consultant. You're left to go and survive or not in the modern world, where if that continuous training was going on all the time, then you've got a far better chance of survival, and therefore your attrition rate decreases and your productivity rate increases, and therefore revenue should go up on a consistent basis. So that's it for this week. Dave, Martin, thank you very much. We are going to do our last webinar of the year next week, so we'll have something special for you for next week. So it'll be the last one of the year. So ladies and gentlemen, thanks for your time. Dave, Martin, thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, Martin. Cheers, H.